Every so often, when you are working on a film or a project or doing something in the creative process, you'll learn something from that project or that experience. Several times throughout my career, if you want to call it that, my education, my time as a filmmaker, I've learned several or many different lessons about so many different things. And when we decided to make our YouTube channel, Doom Productions, we decided that we wanted to share that information with other people. We wanted to pass on the stuff that we had learned so that other people could learn from us, learn from our mistakes, learn from our successes, and just share all the different things that we've learned because we really value education here at Doom Productions. And there are two little bits of advice that have kind of been on the back of my mind that I've learned in the last few years. And I don't think I've had time to sit down and make a YouTube video about them. They're kind of miscellaneous, and I wanted to share these two random pieces of advice because I've just been thinking about these things recently. And so I wanted to make a video about these two pieces of advice that I've been thinking about recently, just because it's been on my mind. And I think if I found value in them, I think other people will as well. So, for context on this first little piece of advice, I want to talk about the project that we're currently working on called Little Black Submarines. It is the biggest project we've ever worked on. I've been editing it for almost a year now. I've been working on it for over a year, and I'm excited for everybody to see it. In Little Black Submarines, there is a sequence, there's a set piece, there is a sequence, there's a thing that happens in this movie. And it is a sequence that, when I was describing it to a lot of different people, it didn't quite click. And it's a sequence where, during the planning process of planning Little Black Submarines, I could tell people weren't quite getting it. And I could tell because of the look on people's faces when I would describe what was going to happen. It's a kind of a weird sequence. I don't want to go into it too much now because of spoilers, but I will be talking about it in depth at a later point in time. This idea that I had, I knew that it was going to be crazy and wild, and I knew that if we pulled it off the way it was done in my head, it would be the standout, most memorable thing done in the entire movie. And when I would tell people what I was going to do in this sequence, I kind of got the same reaction from everybody, which is just this reaction of, oh, okay, that could be cool. It was this very polite, complimentary thing where people would say, oh, yeah, that'll be cool, but I could tell that they weren't really getting what I was going to do. In planning the sequence, I used a bunch of different drawings, I used a lot of descriptions, I used um, music sheets. I used all these different tools and things to try to convey what I was trying to do. But still, people weren't quite getting it. There was definitely a certain point when I could tell that Ethan and Zach got it before we shot the movie. But even when we were on location filming the sequence, I could tell that when I described the sequence to the entire crew, because this is one of our last days of the film that we were shooting, I was describing what we were going to do, and again, I was getting that reaction of, "Oh, okay, that could be cool." And again, I could tell people didn't get it, but again, I knew in my heart that it was going to be awesome if we could pull it off. And we went forward, we pushed forward, and as we were shooting the sequence, not everybody, but there was a couple of people where it finally clicked what the sequence was going to be like. And I remember even at a specific moment when Caleb Robinson, one of our producers on the film, he came up to me when we were shooting the sequence, and I don't know if it finally clicked for him then or when, but he came up to me and was like, I think this is going to be a really cool sequence. This is going to be awesome. And I remember that because as we were shooting the sequence, this kind of weird idea, people were getting it. Since filming that sequence, as we've been in post production, I feel like some of that clarity has been a little bit muddied recently. Because for the longest time, in the timeline for the movie, when I've shown people cuts of the film, there's just existed a title card that said, this X sequence is going to go here. This thing is going to happen. Trust me, it's going to be awesome. And as we got into the weeds of editing this sequence and putting it together, I could tell people were still, they were kind of there, they were kind of not getting it. It was kind of this weird mixture of they could see what the end product could be, but they weren't quite sure how we would do that or what exactly it was going to look like. It was very vague. It was one of those things of like, now this is an over dramatic example, but I would imagine it would be like going back to like the 1700s and telling people, hey, in the future, there's going to be this box that will display you moving pictures and moving images, and you'll be able to watch things called videos. And I would imagine if you told people that back then, they would have been like, okay, so there's going to be a box that'll show me things. That sounds cool, but how it's made, I don't know. What benefit to me that will be, I don't know. But that's kind of that's kind of the vibe I was getting from the crew members and the people who I was showing the movie to. It wasn't until recently that there was a substantial amount of work put into the sequence that I was able to drop this sequence into the movie, and where there were missing shots, I was able to put in storyboards instead. So effectively, I had an animatic with the storyboards and with a handful of completed shots in the movie. Most of Little Black Submarines by now is done, and this is the only sequence in the entire film which is really in a rough form. It's really in a kind of messy, unfinished state. But despite all that, ever since I put that sequence into the movie, that has been the number one standout scene of anybody who's watched the movie. Everybody who's watched the movie since I dropped that sequence in there has told me that was the standout sequence in the movie. That was the coolest thing in the movie. I remember that sequence and I remember the climax of the movie. Those two moments were the standout moments. And finally, after kind of almost a year of working on this thing, it's clicked for people. It's clicked for people in a way where it didn't click before. People have finally understood it because it wasn't me trying to explain it with words or use pictures or use descriptions or anything like that. They were able to just see it. Even in a rough state, they got it, and to them, it was effective. Now, if you've seen a recent cut of Little Black Submarines, you probably know what the sequence is that I'm talking about. But for everybody else, I'm going to keep it spoiler free. But I wanted to use that as kind of a springboard to talk about my first point, my first piece of advice that I'd give to anybody, is when you're making a movie, oftentimes you will struggle to put your ideas into words. You might even struggle to put your ideas into pictures or music, or however you brainstorm. You'll struggle to find a way to convey what you want to do to your crew and the people you're working with. Sometimes you're struggling because you haven't clearly thought out your idea. Sometimes you're struggling because you haven't planned through it, you haven't thought through it very well, and problems are arising. However, every so often, you will struggle to put ideas for your film into words, and that is a good thing, and that is a sign that you are on the right track. Because again, the thing that I was struggling the most with putting into words was this one sequence in Little Black Submarines. And since it's been finished and viewable in a rough form, people have finally gotten it, and it's been the standout moment of that film, even though it's unfinished. So if you're working on a film and you're struggling to put your ideas into words, I would highly encourage you to ask yourself, am I struggling to put this into words because I haven't thought this through? Or am I struggling to put this into words because this is a very unique cinematic moment that can only be described through the language of cinema? And if it's the second option, you are on the right track. Because a lot of times when we encounter those difficulties in communicating our ideas to people, sometimes we kind of second guess ourselves and we lose track of things. And we suddenly find ourselves wondering, oh, gee, is this a good idea? Is this a dumb idea? I don't know what I'm doing, all that kind of nonsense. But if you've thought through your idea and you think it's really cool and you struggle to put into words, I would highly encourage you to push forward, even if people don't quite get it, even if people don't quite understand your vision, because I promise you, there will be a time when they will, and it's going to feel awesome. Related to this idea and the sequence from Little Black Submarines, again, I'm being vague because I don't want to spoil it for anybody, because obviously the movie's not out yet, only a handful of people have seen the movie, but related to this sequence from Little Black Submarines is another idea, another piece of advice that I would like to pass on to other people, because it's something that really defines how I work and is really special to me, and it is kind of not my modus operandi, not necessarily my motto, but it is a strong foundation of my creative process. And that piece of advice is this: when you have a creative choice to make, ask yourself, what would Hollywood do? And if the answer is yes, do the opposite thing. Now, sometimes Hollywood gets it right. The filmmakers in Hollywood are very good at a lot of different things, but more often than not, they are often afraid of taking risks. They're scared to try new things. So as a result, their movies turn out very safe and bland. The sequence that I've been talking about in Little Black Submarines is something that I have never seen in Hollywood do. And I don't think it's something Hollywood would do because they have the tools to be able to do it the normal, safe way. We're coming from a very no-budget filmmaking space, so we had to get very creative with how we did the sequence. And there was a time when we were faced with this decision, which was, do we try to replicate what Hollywood can do knowing that we can never really do what they do at the fullest extent? Or do we do this opposite thing, this thing that Hollywood would never ever do, and something that they probably would never even try, something that they would never even think of? And again, we did the opposite of what Hollywood would have done, and now it's the standout sequence in the film. A more tangible example of this would be from my last film, Two Little Ghosts. In Two Little Ghosts, slight spoiler alert, halfway through the film, the movie turns into a silent film. All the sound is immediately dropped. There's no music, there's no ambiance, there's no room tone even. It's pure silence. And it was one of those decisions that was made near the end of shooting while I was editing the movie. And I had edited the movie up until about halfway through. And to me, it just felt right to cut out all the sound. It felt right to take out the color and change up the aspect ratio. That all felt really good and right to me. It was weird. It was something that I had never really seen done before in a big Hollywood movie. And I asked myself that, you know, if I was making this movie in Hollywood or at Netflix even, would they let me do this? And the answer was no. I don't think they would have let me turn the second half of Two Little Ghosts into a silent film. And so that idea excited me because part of the way I work is I like to experiment and I like to innovate and I like to try new things because I get really bored when I'm making the same thing over and over again. I get really bored when I'm watching the same movies over and over again. So to see something that I've never seen before is something that excites me. So it's not just done out of a place of wanting to be rebellious and stick it to the man and defy Hollywood in all aspects. Again, I think there's some really great things that Hollywood can do, but I think a lot of times when there's a formula, Hollywood likes to stick to that formula, and then the art loses its edge and it's very safe and it's sometimes very bland. And that's one of the wonderful freedoms about working at a no budget level because there is no studio telling me what to do. I can kind of make those whatever decisions I want and ideas that feel fresh and new and exciting to me. Maybe you disagree with this advice, and that's fine. That's totally your right. But for me, when I'm watching a movie or when I'm working on something, if it's something that you can struggle to put into words, and if it's something that Hollywood doesn't do, those are two things that very much excite me, both as a filmmaker and a viewer. So if you're working on a new film right now, ask yourself these questions. Is there anything in this movie that you are struggling to put into words? Not because you haven't planned, but because it can only be described through cinema. And is there anything in your movie that Hollywood would never do? Or does your movie feel very safe and very Hollywood-like? And there's not a problem with that either, but those are two questions that really guide my creative process and I think could help other people out as well. If you want to hear more about this new movie we've made called Little Black Submarines, you can check out this video we made a while back. Thank you so much for watching, everyone.